and unsurpassed, penetrating and perfect Dharma is rarely met with, even 100,000 million kalpas. Having it to see and listen to remember and accept, I vow to taste the truth of the Tathagata's words. Good morning, dear ones. This morning, I would like to begin a series of talks on the Bodhisattva heart. Say the Bodhisattva way, or the Bodhisattva ideal. The title I like to give it is the Bodhisattva heart. In scholarly circles, it's discussed as the Bodhisattva ideal, and in traditional literatures, often it's spoken of as the Bodhisattva way. But basically, it's this issue of Bodhisattva. What is the Bodhisattva? What is the Bodhisattva's way? The Bodhisattva's heart? So this is the inaugural Dharma talk on that. And I intend to structure the talks as kind of an extended commentary on Shantideva's aspirational prayer, which I will try to make sure to say before the end of this talk. But this talk is more an argument in favor of the ridiculous aspiration of the Bodhisattva, an argument for the absurdity of the Bodhisattva way, one might say. So what am I talking about here? What is the Bodhisattva heart, or the Bodhisattva ideal? Well, in one of Thich Nhat Hanh's talks that I was listening to once, it was a talk on compassion, so this is about compassion. He said that there's two great wings of the Mahayana bird. Mahayana is the great vehicle, a later development in the history of Buddha Dharma. And the two great wings of the Mahayana bird are wisdom and compassion. And he was saying that you can't fly with just one wing. He was presenting the argument for the cultivation of compassion because you need both wings. And you do. When we talk about wisdom, Zen emphasizes wisdom. We have Manjushri is the ideal bodhisattva in Zen, and there's a large emphasis placed on wisdom. When we speak of shunya, emptiness, when we speak of pratitya samutpada, the interconnectedness of all things, when we talk about Buddha nature or true nature, or when we say that the vast original mind is mountains and rivers, and the great earth is the sun and moon and stars, that's teachings on wisdom, on insight into the true nature of things. When we talk about compassion, we're talking about the Bodhisattva way, the Bodhisattva vow, bodhicitta, which we'll get into. The word bodhicitta literally means bodhi, awakening, chitta, mind or heart. So it's the mind of awakening, but it implies more than just that. Bodhicitta implies the heart that is so distressed by the suffering in the world, heart that is so distressed about the suffering of beings, that heart has to do something, but also realizes that to be effective, skillful at helping, you have to have some good common sense. You have to have supreme common sense, or else you could just mess things up. And so bodhicitta is the heart that vows to attain complete awakening, not for oneself, but in order to be of benefit to beings. So that's when you unpack awakening mind, it implies that motivation of compassion, of limitless compassion in that terminology, which is not explicit in the terminology. So it's always important to give more depth to what bodhicitta actually entails. And so that's the compassion side of the great Mahayana bird. The compassion wing is the aspiration to practice the way, not for one's sake alone, but for the sake of all sentient beings. That's the Bodhisattva heart. It's important to state that, Nat Han presented it as these two wings of the Mahayana bird. It's also taught that actually it's two sides of one coin, that they go hand in hand, that they cannot be separated, that they entail one another, that to see wisdom is to see dependent co-arising interconnectedness, is to see that others is not other than oneself. That's the eye of wisdom, to see others as not other than oneself. Now, the psychodynamic implication of that seeing is love. That would be a definition of love. So wisdom and compassion are actually the same. But we can look at the coin from one side or the other. We can emphasize one side or the other. But in actuality, they're the same. It's one thing. This morning, I'm not going to get into the evolution of Buddha Dharma that led to the Bodhisattva ideal. I will want to get into that, but that's not this morning's task. This morning's task is to, like I said, argue for the reasonableness of this ridiculous vow to save all sentient beings, or to live for the benefit of all beings. The Bodhisattva ideal is an artifact. It's a human artifact of reason and spirit. Human beings created it. However, I want to try to present a notion that there's an ontological basis for the creation of such an artifact, that there's some reason within our human condition, our human predicament. There's some reason within those conditions that makes such a thing a reasonable thing to do, that makes such a thing make sense. That's what I mean by there's an ontological basis for creating this thing, this human thing called the Bodhisattva vow. And I want to try to get into that by sharing with you something that Norman Fisher taught in the 2019 winter practice period at Tassajara, the first talk after Tongariro, after the opening of the practice period. It's a great talk. You should listen to it. I'm going to try to remember to post it on our Facebook page so that make it easier for you to do what you should, listen to it. It's always good to help people to do what's in their own best interest if you can. That's part of that Bodhisattva way, actually. He started that lecture by reading from Dogen's fascicle Ango, which means practice period. And Kaz Tanahashi translates it as practice period in this edition of Shobogenzo. So I'm going to read this opening of Dogen's to practice period, and then I'll give you Norman's commentary on it. So don't be surprised if this makes no sense whatsoever. That's part of the fun of these things, I think, is to dwell in confusion for a little bit. So Dogen begins by saying, in an informal talk to open the summer practice period, Ru Jing, my late master, old Buddha, Tin Tong, presented this poem. Piling up bones in an open field, gouging out a cave in empty sky. Break through the barrier of dualism and splash in a bucket of pitch black lacquer. So that's the poem. I'll read it again. Piling up bones in an open field, gouging out a cave in empty sky. Break through the barrier of dualism and splash in a bucket of pitch black lacquer. So that's the poem that Dogen said his late master, old Buddha Tin Tong, presented at the beginning of practice period. My not yet late master, Norman Fisher, opening the 2019 practice period at Tassajara, gave this commentary on that rather confusing poem. His first statement: the truly radical teaching of the Buddha and the beginning, middle, and end of the Buddhist path is that suffering is built into time, space, and consciousness. It cannot be avoided. Okay, there's that statement, right? First noble truth, Buddha says, there is suffering, there is dukkha. And Norman is underscoring that rigorously. The truly radical teaching of the Buddha is that suffering, and he says, and the beginning, middle, and end of the Buddhist path is that suffering is built into time, space, and consciousness itself. It cannot be avoided. Okay. Assuming for the moment that that's true, you may take issue with it, but for the sake of argument, assuming that that's true, that suffering is built into reality itself, time, space, and consciousness itself. Well, what options does that leave us? Well, one is the ostrich option. Try to ignore it, try to repress it, try to deny it. Like the denial of, I forget who wrote The Denial of Death, some philosopher, psychologist. But like the denial of death, the denial of suffering requires us to shut down to some extent, shut down our awareness of what's actually going on. We are going to die. Our loved ones will leave us. If not by hopping in the car and going to a warmer climate, by dying. And we can deny that, and we tend to deny that. The bulk of humanity tends to deny that. Part of our awareness shuts down. Part of our consciousness shuts down. We're not fully alive. I argue likewise, if we shut down to the radical teaching about suffering, we have to shut down part of our heart, part of our awareness, part of our capacity to know what life is. So that's one option, probably the most prevalent option. The other option is total freak out, just go insane or commit suicide. You just the despair becomes overwhelming, and you just lose reason, lose the capacity to function because and that's more courageous perhaps than the first alternative. But it's not a very it's kind of maladaptive. It's not very adaptive to the situation to freak out in that way. So is there another option? Because neither one are very functional. They either limit function or they disrupt it entirely. Denial doesn't work so well because we're not fully alive. Freak out, then the system's on tilt. When we checked out of sanity, checked out of reality altogether. Well, what other alternative is there? Well, let's look again at Norman's commentary to that poem. I'll restate the predicament. The truly radical teaching of the Buddha and the beginning, middle, and end of the Buddhist path is that suffering is built into time, space, and consciousness. You will die. Your loved ones will die. Suffering, war, confusion. It's built into our situation. It cannot be avoided. But, see, there's more to what Norman said than that. But it can be transformed. And here comes his commentary on that poem. Let me read that poem again, just to give you a sense of how he's interpreting the poem. So the poem, oh my goodness, did I lose my place? No. Back. No, bear with me. I do that sometimes. I take out the bookmark, I forget to put it back in, and then decide I want to refer back to something, and I've lost it. Here we go. The poem of Dogen's late master, old Buddha Tin Tong. Piling up bones in an open field. Gouging out a cave in empty sky. Break through the barrier of dualism. Others are no other than yourself, right? Break through the barrier of dualism and splash in a bucket of pitch black lacquer. Okay, this time, just in case, I'm going to make sure to put that there. Okay, so the truly radical teaching of the Buddha and the beginning, middle, and end of the Buddhist path is that suffering is built into time, space, and consciousness. It cannot be avoided, but it can be transformed. Throwing away our lives, gouging out a cave in emptiness. We can crash through our limitations into limitless love. Splashing in pitch black darkness and going beyond everything we think we know. So that's the commentary to the poem, We can transform our suffering. How? Throwing away our lives, abandoning this addiction, pardon me, this addiction to perpetual self-referential awareness, always seeing life through the lens of self and other. Abandoning dualism is how Tin Tong put it. So, throwing away our lives. It's safe, He who would save his life is going to lose it. Those who lose their life for the sake of something more precious will find their actual life. We'll save it. So it's okay to throw away your life, given the situation of suffering built into the structure of space, time, and consciousness. Why not throw it away in a constructive way, not in a destructive way of compromising your reason, your sanity? So throwing away our lives, gouging out a cave in emptiness. So that speaks to the ultimate, shunya, emptiness. Cultivating some appreciation for the lack of inherent stability in anything, that that's just how things are. They rise and pass, they arise and pass. They don't perdure. If they perdured, they'd be dead. They'd be a statue. They wouldn't be alive. Life requires transiency. Life requires death. Life requires emptiness. It's challenging to actually let go and rest in transience, but transience is essential for the dynamic of living. So gouge out that cave in emptiness. By doing so, we can crash through our limitations into limitless love. Splashing in pitch black darkness, knowing we don't know, and knowing we don't know, we can go beyond everything we think we know. So, as I was proposing, this is my ontological argument. Some theologian created an ontological argument for the existence of God. That's not what I'm doing here. I'm creating an ontological argument for the reasonableness of the ridiculous Bodhisattva vow. That's the only thing that is actually holistic, if we accept the premise that Norman proposes here, which is the first noble truth. If we accept the premise that suffering is built into the structure of time, space, and consciousness itself, the only wholesome, the only healthily adaptive response is this: finding a way to plunge into limitless love. That's the third alternative. The first one was the ostrich indifference, trying to ignore, trying to deny the reality of our situation. We're all going to die. Have I said that yet? That's the first alternative, and it don't work because you are going to die. The second one is total freak out, total despair, plunging into insanity, deep dark depression, nihilistic despair, and perhaps suicide or something self-destructive, some modality of the reality is too difficult to bear and I can't ignore it. Like the ostriches do. For some reason I don't have that capacity, so I freak out. The third is, given the ubiquitousness of suffering, the all-pervasiveness of suffering, arouse a limitless aspiration to love as a response to this all-pervasive suffering. That's the one that will allow us to retain our sanity and be fully awake, because we're not running away from the problem. And we found the only resource that can effectively meet the reality of the situation. That's my argument. That the Bodhisattva heart, or some version of it that may be not Buddhist, is the only resource that will actually allow us to stay fully awake and fully sane at the same time. Anyway, I don't know if you buy it or not, but that's my ontological argument for the necessity of the Bodhisattva foolishness. Now, what is the Bodhisattva foolishness? Maybe now would be a time to recite for you Shantideva's aspirational prayer that I intend to look at over the next few talks. And it's in a three-part structure. The first part is the taking of refuge. The second part is arousing bodhicitta, which I talked about briefly earlier. And the third part is the vow, the statement of commitment, of intention. So the first part is with the wish to free all beings. I take refuge in Buddha, Dharma, no, with the wish to free all, I should have written it down. I have it by memory, but now, of course, my memory is being faulty. With the wish to free all beings, I will always go for refuge to the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha until the attainment of full awakening. Okay, there it is. With the wish to free all beings, I will always go for refuge to the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha until the attainment of full awakening. That's the refuges, the arousal of bodhicitta. Today, in the presence of the Buddha, I arouse the precious bodhicitta for the benefit of all beings. So that's the arousing bodhicitta part. Today, in the presence of the Buddha, I awaken the precious bodhicitta for the benefit of all beings. And then the statement of intention: for as long as space endures, and for as long as living beings remain, until then, may I too abide to dispel the misery of the world. So, with the wish to free all beings, I will always go for refuge to the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha until the attainment of full awakening. So, taking refuge with the intention to support helping beings become free. And then, I forgot a line. Inspired by wisdom and compassion, today in the presence of Buddha, I generate the precious bodhicitta for the benefit of all beings. I forgot that first part. Inspired by the two great wings of the Mahayana bird, wisdom and compassion, today in the presence of the Buddha, I generate the precious bodhicitta for the benefit of all beings. Now, suffering is built into the structure of space, time, and consciousness itself. Therefore, for as long as space endures, and for as long as living beings remain, until then, may I too hang out and dispel the misery of the world. So that's the aspirational prayer of Shantideva that I encountered long, long ago, reading a book of a collection of talks by His Holiness the Dalai Lama. And at the end of one talk, I can't remember which, he stated this and he recommended it, and I took it, I took him up on it. When I was in Tassajara, I was wanting to practice bowing, I want to do 108 bows every morning. Norman said, well, start with 26 and see how that goes. And I says, and I wanted to do this verse, Shantideva's, and he said, okay, go for it. And sometimes I would feel very silly. How could I, for as long as space endures, for as long as living beings remain, vow to abide? Who the heck am I to say such a thing or to think such a thing? And then I would have other moments where I would feel like, if this is part of the human capacity to awaken such intention, and given the existential need for it, who am I not to? How could I who am I to think I can withhold myself from this? I would have that kind of thought occasionally. And sometimes I would just do it with a simple sincerity, where who am I to, who am I not to, wasn't in my mind. I just did it from a calm, subtle, simple heart. And so I've been doing it now 30 years or so, that, whenever I bow, if I'm not chanting something else, which we sometimes do, taking refuges or during the Bodhisattva ceremony, we're paying homage and chanting other things. If it's bows without chanting inside, even if, it just comes up, it's so entrained in me that, I would have to make a delivery. I don't know if I could not, it's like, don't think of an elephant, I can't not hear that verse in my head when I prostrate, unless I'm chanting some other verse. So, if we reflect deeply on suffering, we can see its value. There's something valuable about the fact that suffering is built into the structure of space, time, and consciousness itself. There's something precious about that. It implies limitless love. So, in this book, which is a collection of lectures Suzuki Roshi gave on Chinese poem Sandokai, he says something interesting. He says, I noticed something very important that I have not emphasized so much before. Suffering is a valuable thing. I understood this today when I was discussing it with someone. Our practice could be the practice of suffering. How we suffer will be our practice. It helps a lot. I think most of you know suffering, as you have pain in your legs when you sit, and in everyday life you have suffering. Why is suffering a valuable thing? We have a little bit of time left, so I'll try to at least introduce this thought, and maybe not fully explicate it, but introduce the thought of the relationship between the so-called ideal and the so-called actual. There's a line in this poem, the Sandokai, which goes, phenomena exist like box and lid, covering principal accords like arrow points meeting. So there's a dynamic tension, a creative dynamic tension between the ideal and the actual. We need the ideal, because we can't not create the world. We create the world with our imagination. It wouldn't be here otherwise. Our imagination is part of the process of bringing forth the world. That's a whole other talk. But the point of it is that something that, and Norman Fisher wrote a book, Imagination and the Bodhisattva Path, I think is the title, something like that, about the 6 paramitas. And I was listening to a talk he gave about the book, and he said, the life we think we're living is a failure of the imagination. It's too small for us. It's not who we are. So we need the ideal, because we need to take responsibility for it, because it's going to come up. It could be a failure of the imagination. Look around you. Look at our world, and you can see copious examples of failure of the imagination. There's a rather hideous one happening in Europe right now. So the life we think we are living is a failure of the imagination. So we need the ideal. The ideal and the actual need each other like a box and its lid. The ideal and the actual meet like arrow points meeting. Of course, no one enjoys suffering. No one enjoys suffering, but our human destiny is to have suffering. How we suffer is the point. We should know how to accept our human suffering, but we should not be completely caught by it. To find the oneness of Re and G, principle and phenomena, idea and actual, to find the oneness of the ideal and the actual, the oneness of joy and suffering. The oneness of the joy of enlightenment within difficulty is our practice. This is called the middle way. Where there is suffering, there is joy of suffering, or nirvana. Even in nirvana, you cannot get out of suffering. We say nirvana is the complete extinction of desires. Well, what that means is to have this complete understanding and to live according to it. This is Zazen. So, it's a great thing that suffering is built into the structure of space and time and consciousness. It's a great thing that we can suffer because we can love. Suffering and joy are so entwined with each other. Love and grief. You can't have love without grief. Ain't no way. Think of that. If you want to know love, you have to be prepared to know grief. There's no escaping it. In the talk that Norman gave, that I'm going to try to remember to post, he talked about his great friend of many, many years, Rabbi Alan Liu. They knew each other and they went to Tassajara together and trained there together. Rabbi Liu obviously eventually became a rabbi, and Norman became a Zen priest, and they had lifelong friendship. And then suddenly, on a walk during a break, leading a meditation retreat, suddenly, without any forewarning or illness, Rabbi Liu just died. And it was devastating for Norman. And in that talk, Norman says, there's a part of me that can't get over the loss of Rabbi Liu. So, and I don't think I really want to, he said. And then he related a story about one of the teachings that Rabbi Liu gave Norman, is that Rabbi Alan Liu he loved to collect fountain pens. He had hundreds of fountain pens, and he decided to sell some of his, thousands of dollars for an antique precious fountain pen, and he decided to sell some of his pens to finance his daughter's education. So he found a buyer, and he sent off the pens, and while the pens were in transit, the buyer died. And the lawyer couldn't find a convincing paper trail, so they said, well, we're not gonna pay you. And Rabbi Allen said to Norman, I thought to myself, I could get a lawyer, but by the time I paid the fees and everything, it'd be a wash. So I just said, okay. So I've lost those pens. And Rabbi Liu said, it taught me something. Something that, is that, you can't do anything when you're dead. The guy who bought the pens couldn't pay him because he was dead. So, well, Norman says, well, you didn't realize that before? He says, well, yeah, but I realized it in a different way now. You can't do anything when you're dead. And then Norman goes on to talk about how Rabbi Liu really cared for people, his family, his friends, that if they were in difficulty, he would get really perturbed and upset. And then Norman said that, that he's not that way, that he hears about a friend who's in trouble, his tendency is just to go about his business, and that he has to make a conscious effort to care for his friends and to focus, attention and take time. And that, you can't do anything when you're dead. So, when we have loved ones who have died, they can't do anything anymore. So we have to do for them. And so Norman says, so I'm going to try for, Rabbi Allen to care more, because he can't do that anymore. So on his behalf, for him. And that's a very interesting and inspiring way to think. I have mentors who are gone. Abbot Steve Stuckey, Abbot Mel Weitzman, precious mentors. They can no longer do. They're gone. But I can do for them. I can try to bring what I know of their spirit into my living. I can't do that if I don't grieve, if I suppress my memory, if I suppress my love and the ensuing pain that comes with it. I can no longer do that. I wouldn't be able to do that. So Norman goes on to say, people want to get rid of suffering. I want more suffering. I want more. I want to care more. So anyway, the Bodhisattva path is not an easy one. It requires taking our, as I said before, with the actual needs the ideal, like a box needs its lid. We're limited beings, but we need the limitless in order to be fully alive. That's the nature of limitation, is it's butted up against limitlessness. That's how you define limitation, by putting in the context of limitlessness. Limitation implies limitlessness. The finite implies infinite. Those two terms mean nothing without each other. So the Bodhisattva ideal is challenging. It requires limitless. It requests of us limitless aspiration. And it may seem implausible, but I propose, with my ontological argument on its behalf, that it's the way to actually stay sane and fully alive in this world which we inhabit. So it's a lot of work, but it beats all the alternatives. I really feel that it's the path of the true human being, to quote Dances with Wolves. May our intention equally extend to every being and place, with the true merit of Buddha's way. Beings are numberless. I vow to save them. Delusions are inexhaustible. I vow to end them. Dharma gates are boundless. I vow to enter them. Buddha's way is unsurpassable. I vow to become it.